someone has died. Not in the abstract, statistical sense that death was a constant feature of ancient life, which it was, at rates that modern populations have no direct experience of. In the immediate, specific, personal sense, someone in your group of 20 people has died, and their body is lying in the shelter where they slept last night, and the group is gathered around it, and nobody is quite sure what to do next. Except that is not actually true. Someone knows what to do. Because this has happened before, not recently, but within living memory. And what was done then was observed by everyone old enough to observe it. And the knowledge of what you do when someone dies has been transmitted through that observation and through the stories told about it afterward to everyone in the group who will need to act on it now. What happens next is not chaos. It is not indifference. It is not, and this is the assumption I most want to challenge today, the simple disposal of a no longer useful biological entity with whatever expediency the immediate situation allows. What happens next is a ritual, a specific, culturally embedded, emotionally weighted, carefully executed ritual that reflects something profound about how ancient humans understood death, what they believed happened after it, and what obligations the living owed to the dead. And those beliefs and those obligations, expressed in physical acts that left physical traces in the archaeological record, are among the most revealing windows we have into the inner lives of ancient humans, into what they thought, what they felt, and what kind of cosmological universe they believed themselves to be living inside. This is the story of what ancient humans did with their dead, and it is not what most people assume. Let's start by establishing what the evidence actually shows, because the archaeological record of ancient mortuary practices is richer and older than most people realize. The oldest evidence of deliberate treatment of the dead, behavior that goes beyond simply leaving a body where it fell, pushes back further into the ancient past than the popular narrative typically acknowledges. At a site called Atapuerca in Spain, in a chamber called the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, archaeologists have found the accumulated skeletal remains of at least 28 hominins, deposited in a deep pit over a period likely spanning thousands of years. The hominin species represented is Homo heidelbergensis, the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, dating to approximately 430,000 years ago. In the pit with the remains, researchers found a single, beautiful red quartzite hand axe, named Excalibur by the excavation team, that shows no sign of having been used as a tool and appears to have been deliberately placed with the dead 430,000 years ago. Not Homo sapiens, not even Neanderthal, an earlier human species apparently practicing some form of deliberate body disposal combined with the intentional placement of a significant object with the remains. Whatever exactly this behavior meant to the people who performed it, and we cannot know the specific cosmological framework they were operating within. It was deliberate, it was organized, and it involved treating the dead differently from the living in a way that required effort and planning. This is the archaeological baseline. Deliberate treatment of the dead going back nearly 500,000 years before our species existed. Let's talk about Neanderthal burial, because this is one of the most debated topics in all of ancient human research, and the debate itself is instructive. The question of whether Neanderthals deliberately buried their dead has been contested for decades, with researchers on one side arguing that the accumulation of Neanderthal remains in specific locations with specific orientations and specific associated objects represents deliberate burial, and researchers on the other side arguing that taphonomic processes, the natural processes by which organic material is deposited, moved, and preserved in the geological record, can explain the same patterns without invoking intentional burial. The debate has not been fully resolved, but the weight of recent evidence tilts clearly toward intentional burial in at least some cases. The site of La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, where a Neanderthal individual was found in a pit with specific positioning of the body and associated animal bones, has been reanalyzed with modern methods, and the deliberate excavation of the pit has been confirmed. The individual had severe arthritis and had lost most of his teeth long before death. He had been cared for and fed by his community for years before he died, and his body was then placed in a deliberately prepared pit at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, the same site where Shanidar I, the disabled Neanderthal, was found. Multiple Neanderthal burials have been documented. The famous claim that flower pollen found at one burial site indicated that flowers had been placed with the dead remains controversial. The pollen may have been introduced by burrowing rodents. but the basic fact of deliberate body placement in the cave, in specific orientations and locations, is not seriously disputed. What these cases tell us, taken together, is that Neanderthals were doing something with their dead that went beyond abandonment or incidental accumulation. Whether this constitutes burial in the full ritual sense depends on what threshold you apply to the word, but the behavior involved deliberate decisions about what to do with dead community members, and those decisions were organized and consistent enough to produce recognizable patterns in the archaeological record. Let's talk about anatomically modern human burial practices and the extraordinary elaboration that appears in the record from approximately 100,000 years ago onward. The oldest confirmed deliberate burials of anatomically modern humans come from sites in Africa and the Middle East dating to approximately 90,000 to 130,000 years ago. At Kafze Cave and Skull Cave in Israel, multiple individuals were found in deliberate burial positions, some accompanied by ochre and by shells and animal remains that appear to have been placed intentionally with the bodies. But the burial record really accelerates in complexity and richness from approximately 40,000 to 30,000 years ago onward, as the cultural efflorescence that produced cave art and elaborated material culture also produced increasingly elaborate mortuary practices. The Sungir burials in Russia, dating to approximately 34,000 years ago, represent the most spectacular ancient burials ever found and deserve extended attention. Two children, a boy of approximately 12 to 13 years and a girl of approximately 9 to 10 years, were buried head to head in a single grave, covered with approximately 10,000 mammoth ivory beads that had been carefully sewn onto their garments. Each bead required approximately 45 minutes to produce. The total bead production time for both burials has been estimated at approximately 7,500 hours of labor. The children were also accompanied by ivory spears, fox teeth pendants, carved ivory animals, a pin, a disc, and other objects of evident significance. An adult male buried at the same site was accompanied by approximately 3,000 beads and a range of other objects. The total investment of time and material resources in the Sungir burials is staggering. In a mobile community operating at the subsistence margins of Ice Age Europe, dedicating the equivalent of years of cumulative skilled labor to the production of objects for burial is an extraordinary statement of the value placed on the ritual treatment of the dead. Let's think carefully about what burial with grave goods actually implies about ancient belief systems, because this is where the mortuary evidence connects most directly to questions about ancient cognition and worldview. Burying a dead person with objects they would need implies a belief that they will need them. Not in this world, they are dead. They have no further use for objects in any materialist framework, but somewhere, in whatever exists after death, in whatever journey the dead are understood to be undertaking, in whatever form of continued existence ancient humans believed their dead community members were moving into. The specific choice of grave goods is informative about the nature of that belief. The children at Sungir were buried with the same kinds of objects that adults were buried with: the ornamented clothing, the ivory objects, the personal adornments. They were not buried with less than adults, which would suggest a hierarchy of afterlife status based on age. They were buried with more than most adults, which suggests either that their social status warranted exceptional treatment, or that the grief of their loss motivated exceptional investment in ensuring they were well provisioned for whatever came after, or both. The ivory spear buried with the adult male at Sungir was not a functional hunting weapon. It was made from a straightened mammoth tusk, using a technique requiring intense heat treatment, and was too large and too impractical for actual use. It was an object made for burial, made specifically to accompany the dead. The community produced an object they knew would never be used for any practical purpose, solely to send it into the ground with their dead. This is not primitive behavior. This is the behavior of a community with a rich, complex, practically expressed belief in the continued existence of the dead in some form that warranted material provisioning. The metaphysics underlying this behavior may have differed from any modern religious framework, but the functional structure, belief in afterlife, obligation of the living to provision the dead for it, expression of that obligation through material investment, is recognizable across the full range of human religious traditions that have addressed death. Let's talk about ochre, because it appears in mortuary contexts so consistently and so early that its significance in ancient death rituals deserves specific attention. Red ochre, the iron oxide pigment that appears in ancient sites worldwide from at least 300,000 years ago, is found in burial contexts across an extraordinary range of ancient cultures, periods, and geographic locations. Bodies and grave goods were covered or dusted with ochre. Ochre was applied to bones before reburial in secondary burial practices. The interiors of grave pits were sometimes treated with ochre before the body was placed in them. Why red? The interpretation of ochre in mortuary contexts has generated extensive scholarly discussion. The most compelling framework connects the color's significance to the symbolism of blood. Red as the color of life force, applied to the dead as an expression of the wish to restore or preserve that force, or as a marker of the transition between the living and whatever comes after. This interpretation is supported by the cross-cultural ethnographic evidence. Red pigment, ochre, or its equivalents, is used in mortuary rituals across indigenous cultures worldwide in ways that consistently invoke associations between red color, blood, life, and the continuation of some form of existence after death. The specific cosmological frameworks differ enormously, but the symbolic association of red with life force applied to the dead appears with remarkable consistency. What this consistent pattern suggests is that ancient humans were working within a symbolic framework that connected red coloration to something conceptually significant about life and death. A framework that produced consistent behavioral expressions across widely separated populations in ways that can only be explained by either a common ancient origin for the symbolism or convergent independent development driven by something fundamental about human color symbolism and death cognition. Let's talk about secondary burial, because it represents one of the more complex and telling ancient mortuary practices that the archaeological record documents. Secondary burial is the practice of initially depositing a body in a primary location, sometimes a temporary grave, sometimes simply exposure on a surface, and then, after an interval, retrieving the bones and redepositing them in a final location. This is a multi-stage process that requires sustained engagement with the dead across an extended period that involves deliberate return to the primary deposit site, deliberate collection of the skeletal remains, and deliberate preparation of a final resting place. Secondary burial practices are documented across multiple ancient and traditional cultures worldwide, and they share a functional logic. The initial deposition allows soft tissue decomposition, and the secondary collection and reburial of the bones represents the final, permanent, ritually significant treatment of what remains after the flesh has returned to the earth. In many cultures with secondary burial traditions, the transition from primary to secondary burial is understood as the transition from the liminal state of the newly dead, still close to the living world, still dangerous, still in the process of leaving, to the permanent state of the fully dead, incorporated into the world of ancestors, safely separated from the living. The cognitive and social complexity of secondary burial is significant. It requires a sustained conceptual framework about death and the dead that operates across months or years of calendar time. It requires community memory of where the dead were initially deposited, and the maintenance of a social obligation to return and retrieve them. It requires a cosmological framework in which the treatment of bones, what remains after the flesh is gone, carries meaning and importance. Ancient communities practicing secondary burial were not performing random behaviors. They were operating within a sophisticated, sustained, communally maintained belief system about the nature of death and the obligations of the living to the dead. Let's talk about the emotional dimension of ancient mortuary practices, because the evidence for ancient grief is as compelling as the evidence for ancient ritual. The Sungir children buried with 10,000 beads, the disabled Neanderthal at La Chapelle-aux-Saints, cared for through years of incapacity and then deliberately buried. The Shanidar cave Neanderthals, placed in specific positions in a cave their community had occupied and returned to across generations. In every one of these cases, the mortuary treatment is not the behavior of a community dealing with a body as a logistical problem. It is the behavior of a community expressing something about the value of the person who died and the loss their death represented. This is grief. Not identical in its cultural expressions to modern human grief. We cannot access the subjective experience of ancient grief in any direct way, but grief in the functional sense, an emotional response to loss that motivates behavioral investment in the treatment of the dead, that makes the death of a community member a significant event rather than an incidental one, that produces the kind of sustained, resource-intensive mortuary behavior documented at ancient sites. The evolutionary basis for grief is well established. The loss of a closely bonded individual represents a genuine fitness cost, and the emotional processing of that loss serves psychological functions that ultimately support the formation and maintenance of future bonds. Grief is the cost of love, and the capacity for love, the deep attachment system-level bonding that makes loss painful, is as ancient as the pair bonding and cooperative social structures that ancient human survival depended on. Ancient humans loved each other. The elaborate care lavished on the dead is the physical record of that love, preserved in the ground for us to find tens of thousands of years later. Let me address one more dimension of ancient mortuary practice that rarely gets discussed but is practically and symbolically significant: the connection between the living and the dead through the ongoing use of burial sites. Ancient burial sites were not simply depositories for the dead. They were places that the living returned to. The evidence of revisitation at ancient burial sites, the reopening of graves, the addition of new materials, the presence of activity debris suggesting that the site was used for ongoing ritual or commemorative purposes, documents a sustained relationship between living communities and their dead that extended well beyond the immediate mortuary event. At several ancient sites, specific graves were reopened after the initial burial, and specific bones were removed. Typically skulls, the most symbolically charged remains in most mortuary traditions, and either redeposited elsewhere or retained for ongoing ritual use. The specific selection of the skull as the object of this continued engagement speaks to a symbolically sophisticated understanding of the head as the site of identity and personhood, and the continued interaction with skull remains as a form of ongoing relationship with the dead individual's continuing presence in some form. This ongoing engagement with the dead, the return to burial sites, the continued ritualizing of specific remains, the maintenance of the dead as participants in community life through physical objects and specific places, is the behavioral foundation of ancestor veneration, the practice of maintaining ongoing relationship with the dead through deliberate ritual engagement. Ancestor veneration in one form or another is one of the most widespread features of human religious practice worldwide, and its behavioral roots are clearly ancient. Here is the picture that emerges when you put all of this together. Ancient humans did not discard their dead. They did not treat death as a purely logistical problem of biological waste management with no further significance. They treated death as a profound transition, one that involved ritual, symbolism, material investment, grief, and ongoing relationship between the living and the dead that extended well beyond the immediate moment of loss. They buried their dead with the things they would need in whatever came after. They covered them with the color of blood and life. They returned to their graves. They kept their bones. They built cosmological frameworks in which death was not an ending but a transition, and they expressed those frameworks in physical acts that cost real resources, required real effort, and reflected real beliefs about the nature of the dead and the obligations of the living. The person in your group who died this morning will be buried, not quickly and not carelessly, with attention, with ochre, with whatever objects their life had given significance to, with the grief of the people who knew them, and the knowledge that what is being done is right, is what is owed, is what has always been done, is what the dead require from the living in the framework that your community has maintained across more generations than anyone can count. The grave will be dug by hand. The body will be placed carefully in a specific position that carries specific meaning. The objects will be arranged. Someone will say something, or sing something, or perform something that marks the moment as significant and acknowledges what has been lost and what is hoped for. And the community will survive this loss, not without grief, but with the specific form of managed, ritually supported grief that the mortuary practices of ancient humans provided, practices that served psychological and social functions as important as any other technology ancient humans developed. Death was not managed away. It was met, directly, ritually, with full human complexity. That was true 430,000 years ago at Atapuerca. It was true 34,000 years ago at Sungir, and it has been true in every human community in every era since.